Metal chains clinked against his wrists as guards shoved him forward. Robert Harrison stumbled, head down, the handcuffs biting into skin that had survived worse. His jacket hung like a tattered flag over shoulders that once carried wounded soldiers through minefields. Underneath, torn fabric revealed faded army patches, ghosts of a life no one here would recognize. His boots told the real story. One had a hole so large his sock showed through, stained with rainwater and shame. The other held together with duct tape, gray and peeling. Each step squeaked against polished marble floors that had never known real dirt. Bobby Harrison, 68 years old, no fixed address. Arrested for sleeping in Jimmy's diner parking lot during a thunderstorm that dumped 3 inches in 2 hours. His crime? Survival. The courtroom smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting shadows that made his hollow cheeks look skeletal. People in pressed suits shuffled papers louder than necessary, avoiding eye contact with the problem in handcuffs. Too frail to threaten, too invisible to matter. But across the room, Judge Elizabeth Morgan's hand stopped mid-signature. Her eyes locked on the defendant's full name in the file. Her son's letters had mentioned that name dozens of times, always the same phrase. If it wasn't for him, I'd never have made it home. Before we continue, if you believe true heroes deserve recognition, type honor below. And tell me where you're watching from. This story of Bobby Harrison proves that dignity can't be erased by circumstances. I read every comment. The prosecutor adjusted his tie with the impatience of a man who had somewhere better to be. District Attorney James Bradford shuffled papers like this was just another routine case. Another homeless veteran disrupting the peace. Nothing requiring special attention or empathy. The public defender hadn't even shown up yet. To everyone in that courtroom, Bobby Harrison was invisible. A statistic. A problem to be processed and forgotten before lunch. But Judge Morgan wasn't like everyone else. She sat at the front of the room reading through the file with eyes trained by 30 years of routine. She flipped pages without hurry until something made her freeze. Her body went rigid. An old memory she kept locked away like a scar suddenly surfaced with crushing force. Robert James Harrison. The name her son had written in emails sent from dusty outposts in Kandahar province, always followed by the same reverent words. Sergeant Harrison saved my life. If it wasn't for him, Mom, I'd never have made it home. Staff Sergeant Daniel Morgan, killed by an IED 3 years after returning stateside. But before he died, he'd written with the admiration only a young soldier feels about the man who'd pulled him from a burning Humvee under enemy fire. She looked back at the defendant. Head down, eyes lost, shoulders curved inward like a man who'd accepted defeat as permanent. Time had destroyed him, and yet it was unmistakably him. Sarah swallowed hard, tried to keep her expression neutral. But the hand holding her pen trembled. The institutional coldness of the room seemed absurd now, obscene even. The hero from her son's stories, handcuffed for seeking shelter from a storm. The bailiff's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. Docket number 847, State versus Robert Harrison. Disturbing the peace, trespassing, public nuisance. Bobby sat motionless in the defendant's chair. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face. His hands, calloused, scarred, marked by years of survival, rested flat on the table. On his left forearm, barely visible through a tear in his sleeve, was an old scar. Jagged, deep, running from wrist to elbow like a lightning strike frozen in flesh. Judge Morgan recognized it immediately from Daniel's descriptions. The scar on Sergeant Harrison's arm, Daniel had written, runs from his wrist to his elbow. Got it pulling me out of that burning Humvee. He says it doesn't hurt anymore, but I see him rub it when he thinks no one's looking. Mom, he's the bravest man I've ever known. The prosecutor's voice grew sharper, more dismissive. Bradford stood with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case like this. Your Honor, we have a repeat offender here. Mr. Harrison has been cited multiple times for loitering, public intoxication, and now trespassing. The business owner of Jimmy's Diner called police because customers were complaining about his presence. Bobby flinched at the word customers. His fingers touched the torn sleeve unconsciously, tracing the scar beneath. The gesture was so small, so automatic that only Judge Morgan noticed. The defendant was found sleeping between two dumpsters, Bradford continued with theatrical precision, surrounded by empty bottles and disturbing paying customers trying to enjoy their meals in peace. The lie hung in the air like smoke. There had been no bottles. The police report mentioned none. But Bobby said nothing. He'd learned long ago that his word meant nothing against a badge and a pressed suit. A few people in the gallery whispered. Someone's phone buzzed. A woman in the back row looked at Bobby with the kind of disgust reserved for things people step over on sidewalks. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting intermittent shadows that made everything feel unstable. The air conditioning hummed too loud, drowning out the sound of Bobby's quiet breathing. He sat perfectly still. Military posture buried under years of defeat, but still there, still holding him upright even when the world had let him fall. Furthermore, Bradford added with a flourish meant for the gallery, vagrancy of this nature creates a public health hazard and diminishes property values in the surrounding area. We cannot continue to allow chronic offenders to exploit public sympathy. Judge Morgan watched Bobby's face carefully. No anger, no defiance, just acceptance. The same quiet endurance that had once made him drag wounded soldiers through minefields was now keeping him silent while strangers decided his fate. The public defender finally arrived, 20 minutes late, briefcase soaked from rain still falling outside. He glanced at the file for maybe 30 seconds before standing. "Your Honor, my client pleads no contest. We request time served and community service. No contest, not even a fight." Bobby looked down at his hands. The scar on his forearm caught the light again. Judge Morgan remembered another line from Daniel's emails. "Sergeant Harrison never complains about anything. Not the heat, not the food, not getting shot at. He just does what needs doing and moves on." "I wish I was half as strong." Bradford smiled, sensing easy victory. "The state recommends 30 days county jail and a $1,000 fine, Your Honor. It's time to send a message that this behavior won't be tolerated in our community." The gallery nodded approvingly. Easy math. One less homeless person on the streets. One less problem to step around on the way to brunch. But then the courtroom door opened with a bang that made everyone turn. "Michael Donovan, attorney at law." A tall man in a dark suit strode in, his voice cutting through the room like a blade through fog. "I'm here to represent Mr. Harrison." Bradford barely hid his sneer. "Last-minute representation, Your Honor. Highly irregular." Judge Morgan's voice was steady as steel. "Accepted. Proceed, Mr. Donovan." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Michael Donovan wasn't just any lawyer. He was a name everyone in Houston knew, a presence in high-profile cases that made headlines. He didn't usually appear in cases like this, but he was here now. And something about the way Judge Morgan looked at him suggested this wasn't coincidence. What nobody in that courtroom knew yet was that everything was about to change. Donovan didn't waste time with pleasantries. He flipped through the file with practiced efficiency, his eyes scanning pages that Bradford had dismissed as routine paperwork. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to confer with my client and review the charges in detail." Bradford objected immediately. "This is a simple trespassing case, Your Honor. There's nothing to review. The defendant was found sleeping on private property. The facts are undisputed." "The facts," Donovan said quietly, "are rarely as simple as they appear." Judge Morgan granted the recess. 10 minutes. In the hallway outside, Donovan approached Bobby with careful respect. The old man looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much and expected nothing. "Mr. Harrison," Donovan said gently, "I need to ask you some questions. Is that all right?" Bobby nodded slowly, uncertain, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Where did you serve?" The question hung in the air. Bobby's jaw tightened. "Afghanistan, Kandahar Province, 3rd Infantry Division." "When?" 2007 to 2010. Donovan made notes. "What was your rank?" "Staff Sergeant." Bobby's voice was barely audible, like saying it out loud might break something fragile inside him. "Why did you leave the service?" Bobby looked down at his hands. The scar on his forearm seemed to pulse with old pain. Medical discharge, PTSD, traumatic brain injury. The paperwork got lost somewhere. I got lost somewhere. Donovan nodded. He'd heard this story before, too many times. Mr. Harrison, do you remember a soldier named Daniel Morgan? Bobby's entire body went rigid. His breathing changed. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes he couldn't hide. Danny, he whispered. I remember Danny. What happened to him? I tried to save him. Bobby's voice broke. I pulled him out of the Humvee when the IED hit. He was burning. I got him out, but... He stopped, unable to continue. But what? He made it home, but he died anyway, 3 years later. I heard about it from another vet. I wanted to go to the funeral, but... Bobby gestured at his torn clothes, his duct-taped boots. I couldn't. Not like this. Donovan placed a hand on Bobby's shoulder. Mr. Harrison, Daniel Morgan's mother is the judge presiding over your case. Bobby's face went white. He looked toward the courtroom doors like he might run. No, she can't see me like this. I failed him. I should have. You saved him, Donovan said firmly. He came home because of you. He wrote letters about you. Called you the bravest man he'd ever known. Bobby shook his head, tears streaming down his weathered face. Then why am I here? Why did everything fall apart? Because the system failed you, Donovan said. But that's about to change. Back in the courtroom, Judge Morgan watched Bobby return to his seat. He wouldn't meet her eyes now. Shame had replaced the blank acceptance from before. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to apologize for the world that had forgotten him. But protocol demanded silence. For now. Bradford stood ready to finish this. Your Honor, unless Mr. Donovan has actual evidence to present, I move we proceed with sentencing. Donovan smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Actually, Mr. Bradford, I have quite a bit of evidence. Evidence that's going to make you wish you'd paid more attention to who you were prosecuting. He placed a thick folder on the table, Pentagon letterhead visible on top. The entire room leaned forward. Donovan opened the folder with the deliberate care of a man holding something sacred. Documents spilled across the defense table. Military records, commendation reports, mission logs that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. Your Honor, Donovan began, his voice carrying the weight of truth too long buried. I request permission to present evidence regarding the true identity and service record of Staff Sergeant Robert James Harrison, United States Army 3rd Infantry Division. Bradford shifted uncomfortably. The confidence from moments ago had started to crack. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant's military service, if any, has no bearing on the current charges of trespassing, and it has every bearing, Judge Morgan interrupted, her voice quiet but absolute. Continue, Mr. Donovan. Donovan held up the first document. On March 17, 2009, in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, a convoy from the 3rd Infantry Division was ambushed by insurgent forces using improvised explosive devices. The lead vehicle was struck directly, resulting in immediate casualties and a fire that threatened to kill everyone inside. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Staff Sergeant Harrison was in the second vehicle. When the IED detonated, he had a choice: stay in relative safety or run through active gunfire to reach men who were burning alive. Donovan read from an official military report, his voice steady. Staff Sergeant Robert Harrison exited his vehicle under heavy enemy fire and proceeded to the burning Humvee. Despite significant personal risk and ongoing hostile engagement, Sergeant Harrison extracted 3 wounded soldiers from the vehicle, including Private First Class Daniel Morgan, who suffered severe burns and shrapnel wounds. Bobby sat motionless, staring at his hands. The scar on his forearm seemed to throb with remembered pain. The report continues, Donovan said. Sergeant Harrison remained in position after ensuring the evacuation of wounded personnel, providing cover fire that allowed the convoy to reorganize and prevented additional casualties. His voluntary decision to stay exposed to enemy fire resulted in the survival of 6 American soldiers that day. A woman in the gallery gasped. Another wiped tears from her eyes. Bradford had gone pale. Your Honor, While this is certainly commendable service, it doesn't change the facts of the current case. Mr. Harrison was found trespassing on— I'm not finished, Donovan said sharply. He held up another document. Staff Sergeant Harrison was recommended for the Bronze Star with Valor and the Purple Heart for wounds sustained during the engagement. The paperwork was submitted through proper channels in April 2009. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Those recommendations were lost in a bureaucratic transfer. Staff Sergeant Harrison was medically discharged 6 months later due to PTSD and traumatic brain injury sustained during the attack. He received no medals, no proper veteran benefits, no follow-up care. The system swallowed his service whole and spit him out on the streets. Judge Morgan's hands were shaking now. She gripped the bench to steady herself. Bobby finally looked up. His face was wet with tears he couldn't control. "I don't want medals," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted Danny to live. I wanted all of them to live." "They did live," Donovan said gently, "because of you. 6 men came home to their families because you ran into fire when everyone else was running away." The gallery was crying now. The court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keys. Bradford tried one more time. "Your Honor, the state maintains that regardless of past service—" "Sit down, Mr. Bradford," Judge Morgan said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was something far more dangerous, disappointed. What happened next would break every rule in the judicial handbook, and Judge Elizabeth Morgan didn't care. Judge Morgan stood. The action was so unprecedented that the entire courtroom froze in collective shock. Judges don't leave the bench during proceedings, ever, but she stepped down anyway. The sound of her shoes on the marble floor echoed like a heartbeat as she walked toward Bobby. The bailiff moved to stop her, but she held up one hand, a gesture that said this moment belonged to something larger than protocol. She stopped 3 feet from the defense table. Bobby looked up at her, confusion and fear mixing on his weathered face. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "Staff Sergeant Harrison," she said quietly, so only he could hear it first. "My name is Elizabeth Morgan. I believe you knew my son." Bobby's face crumpled. Recognition and pain hit him like a physical blow. "Danny," he whispered. "Oh, God, Danny." Judge Morgan reached into her robe pocket. When her hand emerged, she held something small, a set of dog tags, tarnished with age, hanging from a worn chain. The entire courtroom held its breath. "Daniel carried these through his entire deployment," she said, her voice breaking despite years of courtroom control. "When he came home, he told me he wanted you to have them. He said you were the reason he got to see home again." She placed the tags gently on the table in front of Bobby. His hands trembled as he reached for them. The metal was warm from being close to her heart. When his fingers closed around them, something broke inside him. A dam that had held back 15 years of grief and guilt and unbearable weight. Bobby pressed the tags against his chest and sobbed. Not quiet tears. Full, body-shaking sobs that came from a place too deep for words. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as this broken man held the physical proof that he'd mattered once, that someone had remembered, that his suffering hadn't been invisible after all. Judge Morgan placed her hand on his shoulder. "He never stopped talking about you," she said. "Every letter home mentioned Sergeant Harrison. You were his hero, Bobby. You gave me 3 more years with my son. I got to hold him, to tell him I loved him, because of you. I should have saved him," Bobby said through tears. "He shouldn't have died. I should have—" "You did save him," she said firmly. "Death doesn't erase what you gave us. You brought him home alive, that's everything." She returned to the bench. When she sat down, her face had transformed from judicial neutrality to something raw and human. Donovan stood. "Your Honor, I have additional evidence to present." He gestured toward the back of the courtroom. The doors opened. 2 officers in full military dress uniform entered, their shoes clicking in perfect unison against the marble floor. One carried a small blue box. Bobby recognized what it was immediately. His entire body went rigid with something between hope and terror. "The United States Army, one officer announced in a voice trained for ceremonies and funerals. "Wishes to correct a grievous administrative error. Staff Sergeant Robert James Harrison, you were recommended for the Bronze Star with Valor and the Purple Heart in 2009. Due to bureaucratic failure, these honors were never properly awarded." The officer opened the blue box. Inside, a Purple Heart gleamed under the courtroom lights, a medal earned in blood and pain, delayed by 15 years of systematic neglect. Bobby stared at it. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "No," he finally said. "I don't deserve it. I failed them. Danny died and I—" "You saved 6 lives," the officer said. "That's not failure, Sergeant. That's heroism." The second officer held up the Bronze Star. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States." The entire courtroom rose to its feet, not because protocol demanded it, but because something deeper than law required it. The officers approached Bobby with military precision softened by profound respect. One knelt beside him, a gesture rarely seen from officers to enlisted men, but this moment demanded exceptions. "Sergeant Harrison," the officer said quietly, "would you stand to receive these honors?" Bobby tried. His legs shook. His body, worn by years of surviving on streets that showed no mercy, barely cooperated. Donovan moved to help him, but Bobby waved him off with a gesture that carried the ghost of old pride. He stood, slowly, painfully, but he stood. The first officer removed the Purple Heart from its case. The medal caught the fluorescent light, transforming it into something almost holy. He pinned it carefully to Bobby's torn jacket, that tattered flag that had hung on his shoulders since this nightmare began. The fabric was barely strong enough to hold the medal's weight, but it held. "For wounds received in action against an enemy of the United States," the officer said formally. Then, breaking protocol, he added softly, "Thank you for your sacrifice, Sergeant." The second officer stepped forward with the Bronze Star. "For heroic achievement in ground combat against armed enemy forces." He pinned it beside the Purple Heart. 2 medals that should have been presented 15 years ago in a proper ceremony with witnesses who understood their weight. Instead, they were pinned to a torn jacket in a courtroom that had almost processed Bobby like garbage to be disposed of before lunch. Bobby's hands went to the medals. He touched them like they might disappear if he blinked. Tears ran down his face unchecked. Tears he'd probably held back for years because crying on the streets was dangerous, made you more vulnerable to predators who saw weakness as opportunity. But here, now, he couldn't stop them. Judge Morgan spoke, her voice carrying the weight of both her position and her personal grief. "All charges against Staff Sergeant Robert Harrison are dismissed immediately and with prejudice. Furthermore, the state will begin immediate processing of all benefits and medical care owed to Sergeant Harrison under federal veterans legislation." She looked directly at Bradford. The prosecutor had shrunk in his chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Mr. Bradford, your office will personally ensure that Sergeant Harrison receives expedited access to VA medical care, housing assistance, and all back benefits he is owed. If there are any delays or complications, you will answer to me personally. Am I clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Bradford managed, his voice barely audible. Donovan pulled out another document. "Your Honor, I've already contacted the Houston VA Medical Center. They've agreed to provide immediate emergency housing and comprehensive medical evaluation for Sergeant Harrison, effective today." Bobby shook his head, overwhelmed. I can't." Judge Morgan stood again. This time, she walked around the bench completely, approaching Bobby as a mother, not a judge. "Bobby," she said, dropping all formality, "Daniel's last letter to me was written 3 days before he died. He asked me to find you if anything ever happened to him. He said you were alone and you shouldn't be. He said you deserved to be remembered." She pulled the letter from her pocket, old paper, creased from being folded and unfolded countless times over 3 years. She placed it in his hands. Bobby read it with shaking fingers. His lips moved silently over words written by a young man he'd pulled from fire, a young man who'd remembered him even when the system forgot. When he finished, he looked at Judge Morgan with something like hope in his eyes for the first time in years. He whispered, "Thank you for remembering." The courtroom remained standing. The officers saluted, a formal military salute directed at a man in duct-taped boots and a torn jacket. And slowly, one by one, everyone else followed. Bradford stood, the public defender, the bailiff, the court reporter, the people in the gallery, all of them saluting a hero they'd almost discarded. 3 months later, the same courtroom hosted a ceremony that made the news. Not because Judge Morgan wanted publicity, but because Bobby's story had leaked and people demanded to see its conclusion. Bobby Harrison stood at the front of the room wearing a new suit, clean-shaven, eyes clear for the first time in years. The VA had provided housing, medical care, and therapy for his PTSD. His hands no longer shook. His shoulders, though still marked by time, carried themselves with rediscovered dignity. Behind him stood the 6 men whose lives he'd saved in Kandahar. They'd tracked him down through military networks, refusing to let him remain invisible any longer. 5 of them brought their families, spouses, children who existed because Bobby had run into fire instead of away from it. Judge Morgan presented him with a plaque. It read, "In recognition of heroism, sacrifice, and the enduring truth that dignity cannot be erased by circumstance." Bobby held it with both hands. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what needed doing." One of the soldiers stepped forward. "You taught us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right when everything's falling apart." The ceremony ended with another salute. But this time, Bobby saluted back. Sharp, precise. The muscle memory of a soldier finally allowed to be one again. Outside, photographers captured the moment when Bobby shook hands with each of the 6 men he'd saved. Their grip said everything words couldn't: gratitude, respect, brotherhood that transcends time and circumstance. Bobby looked at the sky. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't looking for shelter from a storm. He was looking at tomorrow. To everyone who typed honor and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this about unsung American heroes. See you in the next one.